everybody, and welcome back to another special Nanosode brought to you by The Book Table, which is brought to you by Backroom Whispering Productions. I, Madeleine, your fearless producer, who you hear far too much of, is here today with Rebecca, who you probably also hear far too much of, because I don't think we've missed anything yet.
We have not. We have been on everything so far. Except, Shelley and Dorothy did a Nanosode.
That's true. We were not on that Nanosode, because we finished NaNoWriMo.
So you are safe from us for a brief moment, but we are back.
We are back, and today we decided we would talk about something which we have emailed about before, but figured it might be a good topic, which was that we have opposite predilections when it comes to picking our POV characters or protagonists, and especially in my case when it comes to the ratio of male to female characters in our stories. I tend to write far more male-dominated stories, while Rebecca has many more ladies hanging out.
All the ladies.
All the ladies. I don't know if they're single or not, so I guess it's just all the ladies.
Most of them are not single.
Beyonce cannot work in this situation.
Yeah, so this is actually a topic that we were really interested in. It kind of started when we first started talking about our NaNoWriMo novels. I'm sorry, NaNoWriMo, I think is how you pronounce it. I pronounce everything incorrectly, including Madeleine's name. So we were talking about it, and Mad was telling me about how her POV character was a male and blah blah blah, and I was getting excited because for the first time ever I had a POV character who was male, and it actually took me a long time to get to the point where I was comfortable doing that. And then we were kind of just glossing over other projects we'd done, and I realized that Mad tended to pick male POV characters, whereas I am far more comfortable with female POV characters and could never I write some stories from first-person perspective, and I don't feel like I could ever write that from a male POV. So we were interested, just as two cisgendered ladies hanging out, why it was that we tend to gravitate towards different gendered POVs. So we wanted to chat about that.
And most of the other topics which I glossed over to Rebecca are all things that are usually in their embryonic stages, which means I have ideas, but that's about it. Or I might have started them, like in the case of one, I had started, got about 50,000 words through, and then realized it was a total hot mess. And it still sits in a sad little folder. And it has, as I sent to Rebecca, a 9-page dossier of the characters, and there was 2 ladies on it.
There were 3. There were 3 ladies.
There were 3 ladies, one of whom identifies as male.
But initially
biologically a lady. And outside of that, I went, wow, I really do write a lot of guys. And I had never really thought about it. And I always kind of wondered if maybe it was because I have 2 younger brothers. I'm a serious daddy's girl. I always hung around with guys a lot in high school and middle school. Most of my closest friends were guys. It wasn't until I got to university, really, that I started making close girlfriends. I always found it easier to slip into their perspective. But I know we've talked about how we create characters and when we're kind of genesising them, which isn't a word, but it is now. I always mention that my characters tend to start out as very gender either neutral or fluid. I don't necessarily write them a very particular gender unless they have to be. In the case of Blood and Steel, I knew very much I was going to have a male protagonist, and I knew very much I was going to have a female antagonist, just because of the Arthurian undertones. So I knew how that was going to work. But with every other thing I've written, most of those characters start out with absolutely no gender assigned to them. And I just it's however they develop.
For me, I think that part of it is that I have a fuller picture of characters when I first imagine them, and I usually imagine them for a purpose. And also, something we've talked about is I tend to write a lot of relationships, and romance tends to be a big factor in my stories, whereas it is not as much for Mad, and she more or less ignores that and avoids it.
Almost entirely, really.
Whereas I have, even if my stories are not super heavy on the romance or nothing is resolved or whatever, there's always an element there, and usually relationships are important, and I usually have 2 main characters who are tied together largely by their feelings/interest in each other, and I don't know if that's based on the sort of books I've read or enjoyed, or if that's just how I experience the world. I don't know. But yeah, so for me, like the gender of characters is clear, even if I have queer characters, which I don't know if we use the word queer. I use it to describe myself. I'm pansexual, and so it's just easiest for me sometimes to say queer as opposed to like LGBTQIA, other I's, many other T's. So I apologize if that's offensive to anyone. But anyway, I've had plenty of characters that have been in those kinds of relationships that are not necessarily heterosexual, but at the same time, I don't know, the gender just matters to me a lot. I think because of the relationship aspect is I have to imagine characters relating to each other in sort of a romantic way, and so that tends to take shape, I think, a lot earlier in my process than it does for you, maybe.
Yeah, it definitely does. I love how you mentioned the because you're pansexual. I say I'm sapiosexual, which for those of you who don't know what that means, I'm really attracted to intelligence. But within that, I'm kind of demisexual, which basically means I'm on the ace spectrum, but I'm really only attracted to people after I've been, like, emotionally familiar with them for a really long time.
I am also demisexual. Great minds, we're twinsies.
We totally are.
Continue.
Yeah. So I think because I'm really more aligned with the ace spectrum, that because of that, romantic entanglements inside of my novels almost never take place. I often have characters who might be emotionally romantic with each other, like there's a connection, but I'll rarely have them act on it, because I don't ever find the place where it feels natural for them to do so. In one story, the one where I sent Rebecca the 9-page dossier, there are 2 characters in it. The one female lead with a male who I face cast as Lee Pace, who she remembers.
Oh, yes.
He's set to die at the end of that story.
Why?
And he and the girl have, like, this serious romantic bond that never gets acted upon. Like, it's, like, so tragic. It is tragic as all get out because they never act upon it. I imagine those 2 characters actually living together, like as roommates, but never actually getting involved because the plot kind of always gets in the way. And for me, it's always when I would try to put in any sort of romantic entanglements, it would feel like I was shoehorning it into the story. And I was like, it just doesn't feel right. They'll have tons of romantic and sexual thoughts about each other, and heck, I might have characters who will just go off and have sex, but it's like, that's about the most I would ever write in terms of romance. And that could reflect my own life in that I've had one boyfriend. It didn't end well. He was someone I'd known for about 10 years. We'd been best friends. And then it all fell apart in the span of like 6 months. So I'm sort of just like, I don't have a good history of romance, so I don't have a lot of familiarity with romance. My understanding of romance comes from novels, from television series and films, and from what I see amongst my friends. Which I always said I was...
get it right on TV, too. TV is just dead on accurate.
Oh, clearly. I mean... Obviously, don't you fall in love with your soulmate at first sight and then get married over the course of 48 hours like in Romeo and Juliet, which I've seen a million times? What?
Yes, especially when my soulmate is a vampire.
And he sparkles, and I had to move out to Forks, Washington to find him, and it's fine. After we defeated the Dark Lord and, took the ring to Mordor and all that jazz. Well, I used to joke, I was the relationship therapist of all my friends. Because I think I had no real romantic entanglements and I'm kind of on the A spectrum, I could be really observant and critical of everything. And because I spent so much time around guys, I really understood their perspectives on the relationship side of it. Because all my friends would come complaining to me. Because I'm a girl, so they'd want the girl perspective. But it meant I was like intaking the male perspective. So I would sit there and just relationship advice everyone while not having a relationship of my own. It's weird when I try and think about including romance in the stories that I imagine in my head or want to create. It always feels so unnatural. I don't know why.
I don't know. I mean, like, that could have something to do with it if it's sort of outside your experience, because, like, I have sort of the opposite experience where I have spent very little of my adult life single. I've had a variety of relationships, and most of them have been semi-long-term, very serious. And actually, as we speak, I'm 3 days away from my wedding.
Which is so exciting!
So definitely, like, romance and relationships is a huge part of my life, but I think it also might have to do a little bit with the literature that we're attracted to, because, I'm thinking back to when you talked about, like, you grew up with brothers, you had mostly guy friends. I actually had a fairly similar experience, although I have plenty of female friends, and always have. It helps that I went to a women's college.
You went to my grandmother's alma mater.
Yes, I went to St. Mary's. Go Bells. But I have 2 brothers. I don't have any sisters. I consider myself a daddy's girl for sure, and I liked to hang out with guys a lot in junior high, high school. I always had guy friends. I had girlfriends too, though. I think it was actually pretty even.
I think I had one.
And I think that the balance of guy versus girlfriends sort of went skewed towards female when I got into college, and obviously was surrounded by awesome women all the time. And when I was younger, I was really attracted to stories that had romantic elements. And sort of my, like, first fantasy, super obsessed with story, other than, like, Harry Potter, which doesn't, was Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marlier, which, actually, what's interesting about it is that the romance isn't a huge part of the plot for most of the book, but...
That's true, it's not.
It's not a huge part, but it's very present there towards the end in really important ways. And then sort of every book that she's written since then, except for her two most recent, are really like a love story that just has more plot. And the love story is just kind of seamlessly woven into the plot and is important to it, but it's not like reading a romance.
Sure.
And definitely when I look for books that are sort of like that. I get really annoyed with YA sometimes because I feel like the romance is sort of thrown in there in a way that doesn't make sense, and it takes away from the plot, and it's stupid, and it doesn't feel like it should be there. But then I also get kind of annoyed when I read books where I feel like there should be something and it's not there, and I feel like authors are avoiding it purposefully because... I don't know if there's like a discomfort in writing it or whatever. I don't consider myself a particularly romantic writer. You still haven't read The Necromancer's Daughter, but at some point...
I haven't. I need to read it. It's going to be my prize to myself for finishing Blood and Steel is I will sit down and just read The Necromancer's Daughter. So I haven't looked at it or I know I'm going to get distracted.
Yeah, so The Necromancer's Daughter there I would consider two like sort of, well, almost three actually, like relationship stories in there, but I would not consider it like a romantic book, and you'd have to ask Dorothy how she feels about that. But I think a lot of it for me is that in a lot of the stories I write from the perspective of women who have been victims of usually like sexual or physical violence. And actually, I don't know, that's a really interesting psychological question of why I do that, because that's not my experience. Even if I don't mean to, most of my main characters tend to come from that sort of background. Often I'll envision it that way originally, or even if I don't, as I'm telling the story, I like sort of discover this about. So I think I'm just really like drawn to that type of character, and they always turn out differently, like as different characters. It's not like I'm writing the same character over and over again. Sure. But I think part of my draw towards then the romantic aspect or whatever is sort of the healing thing of it, is that I don't feel like it's unrealistic to write a world in which like women have only terrible experiences of men, or it's just unfair to my characters to not give them like a little bit of relief, I think, from sort of the suffering that they have. So that tends to happen a lot. But also I think that I actually don't really know how to write a male character who is not a love interest of a female character. And that's even the POV character that I have in my current project, Dark Sea Rising. I ended up writing him because I felt like I understood him better than the female that he's sort of in relationship with. And so wrote him as the POV instead, but again, like, he was just originally envisioned as this sort of like, oh, I have to have a love interest for my whatever. And so, I don't know, I think that's interesting because a lot of times I think in TV and like popular media it's flipped, where you get females in a story that are just sort of inserted in there as the love interest, and I do that with males, and that actually... never really thought about it like that.
Yeah. No, that is really interesting because I then look at, with Blood and Steel, all the relationships, you have one family relationship that's alive. You have one with one of those same characters. Thea, he's got the relationship with Peleus, that's his cousin. He has a father-like relationship with Welt, who's my protagonist. He has a dead father who he clearly still has daddy issues with. But then the primary relationship is really between Welt and Myrda, and they hate each other. Well, kind of. Welt is intrigued with Myrda. He doesn't realize the depth of her pure hatred for him. Absolutely pure hatred.
She's certainly a super.
Oh, and she hates him, and I was like, I didn't create love interests, I created hate interests, which is sort of with that, and then I start thinking of the books that I tend to gravitate towards. I read plenty with a good deal of romance, and I'm like the person who's the ultimate shipper. I'm going to start shipping people, the moment they are introduced. I read the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas, and in the most recent book, my ship went down in flames, and I was, so upset. that I didn't like the book. However, I will say that's an interesting series in that the main character, Selena Sardokian, has sex with like 3 different characters over the course of 4 books now. And it's sort of like one of them, she's like, I'm doing it because I'm acknowledging that I'm physically attracted to you, but like this isn't going to go anywhere. And another one, it's actually really sweet. And then another one, it's like a whole other thing. And I was like, this is more realistic to me.
Okay, so for all of you listeners that love TBT, we're going to have a special coming out for Valentine's Day that's about sex and fantasy. And so that just, I feel like that's going to fit into part of our discussion really well. So be prepared for more of that.
Yeah, so you'll hear more on Throne of Glass when I get the chance to sort of talk about the relationships and that. But I'm looking at my shelf going, you know, actually a lot of these have romance. And I have some books on here that are basically YA contemporary, which tends to feature a lot of romance. And I'm like, I like romance. I like reading it. I just have such a hard time writing it. It just never feels right. I think oftentimes I'm more interested in writing either characters like their minds. I'm more interested in how they think and kind of what makes them tick and how they relate to other people, but in a very non-romantic way. Probably because I read too many books where the romances were awful and I couldn't stand it. And oftentimes the main couple of stories I didn't ship. I didn't like it. So I have a tendency to write characters and write more about how they think and not involve romance in it. Or, like in the case with my 9-page dossier that I sent you, the plot is so incredibly intricate and massive, and there are a ton of character relationships, familial, friendships. I'm just like, I have no room for romance in here. Like, trying to fit a romance in here would make my head crack open. Like, I have the unrequited one, and I'm fine with that. I don't want to do any more than that. Oh, actually, I have multiple unrequited ones, actually, now that I think about it. But I'm curious how it is. We both have similar experiences growing up. We have brothers, we're daddy's girls, and I had some female friends in high school, but not a lot. How it is, I have a tendency to gravitate more towards writing male characters, whereas you definitely gravitate towards the female characters. And as you said, you have a hard time writing male characters. Is it just not quite knowing how they're going to think when you're trying to write them, or is it like discomfort? Like, I'm sort of curious about this.
I don't know, like, and so that's what I wonder about, because actually, you know, those psychological tests and whatever you can take, like, is your brain male or female? I always get male.
Really?
And I definitely, like, I'm a cisgendered woman, and I super identify as a girly girl often, but at the same time, I totally understand at least what the tests test for in terms of males are more likely to react this way, whatever.
Oh, yeah.
I can totally buy that I have a male sort of brain. But at the same time, I just feel like my experience has been so female. And I think that's part of it, is that my characters, like, while they're certainly not me, they have to be enough me that I can tell their story as though I understand it, if that makes sense. And I just don't feel like I have any experience as a male, you know, operating as a male in the world. And I just don't, I don't know. And I don't know if it's because I often write fantasy, so I'm dealing with sort of a exaggeratedly gendered world where men tend to be the ones who are like fighting, and then women actually are usually the rulers, and
because the men were never there.
And so I don't know if that has something to do with it, is that I don't really know how to fight, and so I wouldn't know how to write from that perspective. And I'm a super non-aggressive person, and not that all males are aggressive. I don't know. Now it's like getting into gender theory and like what even is gender. So I don't know. Like, honestly, until we had talked about it like a month and a half ago, I literally never thought about it. And so I remember sort of thinking about it when I was reading Harry Potter, and like J.K. Rowling's a girl and she's writing a boy's perspective, and hearing like my brothers like, oh, a guy would never think like that. Especially when it was getting towards like the Ginny storyline and like book 6.
That's so funny because
they're just like guys, just that's not how they think about that. So I don't know if actually that like was deeply embedded into my psyche when I was a teen, that like women can't write from a guy's perspective, and I'd get it wrong. So I couldn't do it, and that might actually have something to do with it, but I don't know, I think I just naturally, like, because I put myself a little bit into my POV characters, and I identify as female, but you obviously also identify as female, and I think that you probably put yourself into your main POV characters as well. I'm not sure it's possible to write and not do that.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a sufficient explanation, because you obviously fall on a different side of the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, and that could easily work for you. I mean, everybody's got sort of their individual process. I do think it's funny what your brother said about Harry Harry Potter because my brothers never made a comment on it. I think they rolled with it. They were totally okay with what happens, especially in book 6, which is where most of that is. But yeah, I definitely, bits of myself and of people who I know definitely end up in my characters. It's not always me. My brothers always seem to worm their way into the characters with like little physical tics or other things that characters will do, and I'll be like, yep, definitely can see how my brothers have inserted themselves in here. Which might also be why I find it easier to write male characters in that it's really easy for me to write my brothers. I could write them all day long. I could easily start writing my brothers as characters because I know exactly what they'd say, how they'd react to things. But yeah, as someone who does identify as female, it is kind of odd that I gravitate towards writing the male voice. And maybe it's because I never really was that much of a girly girl. I was in elementary school, but there was a definitive shift from elementary school through middle school into high school and all that where I lost any aspect of being a girly girl. Like, I used to be the girly girl wearing dresses, looking all cute and like being adorable, and now I'm just like, you can force me into a dress for special occasions, and other than that, I want to wear my jeans and my t-shirts and my sweatshirts and be comfortable, and like, I don't care that much about all the traditionally feminine things, like looking really nice and dressing really nice and being like passive and like demure, and I'm just like, ha 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 ha, if you think I'm passive and demure, you've been hit in the head. I'm a very outwardly aggressive person, but yeah, it's, whenever I try and write a female voice, I can do it. It's not like I can't. I have several stories that are like kind of embryonic where I'm like, yeah, I definitely have female protagonists and they'll be in there. Well, in one case, I have like 20 protagonists in that one, so I mean, she's one of many. I can write female protagonists. I'm just always like, it's easier for me to slip into a male voice and just write it. And I think it's because most of the guys I've always known are very to-the-point people. They do. They just speak very much to the point. They speak what's on their mind, and that's it. They're very upfront and direct. Whereas a lot of the girls I knew, especially in high school, but let's be real, everybody is awful in high school, were very passive-aggressive, kind of sneaking around each other's backs, and I hated it. I hated the whole politics of it. So I didn't want to write girls, because I would always think of those girls who I knew. And then, when I made some, like, proper, basically, girl friends, I was like, oh, I guess I could write them, too. Like, they tend to, now, in my female characters, like, they tend to take on aspects of a bunch of my friends, not necessarily myself. I might give, like, 1 or 2 aspects of myself to the characters, but, like, small things, really small things, like weird habits or tics that I have. I can then hone into the character's emotions based on like this one physical tic they'll be doing that I know I have. It's so insane to think about because it's one of those things you never really think about until someone points it out to you. I genuinely never realized how many male protagonists or point of view characters I tended to write, especially in relation to the number of females I would have written, until you pointed it out to me. Then I was like, well, damn, I really do have a tendency to write predominantly men.
Yeah?
It's wild. It's really weird to think about. So I know for myself, as much as I would love to write more female characters, I feel bad that it's like an idea, oh, I should write more female characters. I'm like, I'm just going to write my characters as they appear. They will continue to be just gender fluid or gender neutral as I envision them, and then settle into their genders as they become more defined. Or, like in the case of one character, have literally no gender.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. Like, I feel like I've identified what I could call a problem in that I really, really only write female POVs, but at the same time, I don't, like, sit down and say, oh, I'm gonna write a project about this thing for this reason. I write the stories that come to me about the characters that come to me, and so it's sort of just, that's my tendency, and I have to accept that, and I am currently working on a project that has a male POV.
That's true.
And it is going to have at least 1 sequel, and in the sequel, I will actually be changing POVs. I have 2 POVs in the current book, and there will be 2 POVs in the next book that are actually going to be the opposites in terms of, I guess, the relationships, although one of them doesn't really count. And the next one, and I'm kind of excited about that, and that actually happened just because I got really interested in this one particular character that sort of started out as like a, he's there, and has become sort of a main character, and I want to tell his story.
Oh, that's so exciting.
So who knows, this might be a trend that continues, but at the same time, the other project that I'm working on right now definitely has a first-person female POV, and that's not changing, so...
And that's the one who wears my face, right? Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. face to the one who wears my face. Team dystopian. What? Currently having a philosophical discussion about human nature and power dynamics.
I know, which is fabulous. So then I need to finish Blood and Steel, and then once that finishes, I'll decide which of my poor little embryonic stories I want to move to next. My issue is I'm always like, I need to go in and have a clear idea, not only of how it opens, but how it ends. Like, if I don't have a clear idea of the ending, we're doomed, because I will sit there and, like, in a quagmire, nothing will happen. It'll be characters having philosophical discussions all day long, and nothing will get done.
Yeah. Oh, although I do want to point out in closing something that I think is interesting that doesn't answer anything, but is just another sort of thought, is that Matt and I we have a couple projects that we're interested in working on together, and one of them is a graphic novel, and that's about two women, but that's because they're kind of super based on us.
Yeah, they are lady detectives, and they will be fabulous.
Lady detectives, Victorian era, going after serial killers in the Midwest, riding velociraptors. What are we talking about? It's going to be awesome.
I'm sorry, who didn't need that in their life?
It's going to be awesome.
But then there's the other one, which is...
But then the other one, which I don't want to get too into, because I have, like, this super thing that someone's going to steal this idea, because it's amazing.
All we'll say is ancient Egypt, and that's all we'll say.
Ancient Egypt, and so we decided we were going to try to write a TV show about an interesting character in history, and of course Mad picked a male character in history.
To be fair, the other one was female.
But what I think is so interesting about that I just thought about while we were having this conversation, is while we were researching these characters that actually existed and developing, Mad was focusing on two male characters that are like real people. This is historically, and she was like, these are so interesting, and we have to write this, and this is going to be great. And then I was thinking about the females that are like part of this, and I'm like, oh, but she is going to be so interesting, and I can't wait to write her, and like, oh, this woman is going to be amazing, and what is this going to happen, and oh, this is going to be great. And I actually, that's like my closing thought, is that it's hilarious that this was like the beginning of our sort of friendship, is when we were first envisioning this project, and that's totally what was happening.
It makes absolute sense.
Getting excited about the male characters to write, and I was getting excited about the female characters to write. So hey, we're going to have a complete script with really interesting male and really interesting female characters, so everyone should get excited about that, because it's totally happening. It's
going to be a fabulous script with male and female characters, which is because there will be the equal balance of you who's very good at writing those very complex, interesting, dominant, like female characters, and there were a lot of them in this particular era of history that we were looking at, and I'm like, and I get the male perspective, so I can roll with that, because there are two in particular where I'm like, oh, I can get you. Like, I will at least understand you, and if I have to fudge it a little and start injecting people who I know into this, fine, but I will get you. So at the end of the day, we have our strengths. Thankfully, when combined, it creates magic, and then it's one of those things. We'll probably just have to keep ruminating on this to ourselves, and through our various emails that we eventually will come to maybe more revelations as to why we think the way we do, or why we gravitate towards the perspectives that we do.
Yeah, and this is actually a fun thing if any of you are listening and you have found articles about this that are specifically about why people tend to write certain genders. Because I don't know if people have done this, if either from a sociological perspective or from a psychological perspective, if people have studied this. Feel free to comment when you're listening, because we are always interested in reading and getting to know stuff and finding answers to our questions.
Because we're curious. This is stuff that we'll actually
clearly
read.
We really want to know.
Clearly, because we're like, we don't.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening.
Thank you so
much. And check in soon for more Nanosodes. We're getting some other writers who you've never heard from that are going to talk about some other issues of writing and writing perspectives, and we're super excited. And then we have two exciting The Book Table conversations coming up. At the end of January, we will be talking about Storm Dancer by Jay Kristoff. And then, of course, our February 14th special on sex and fantasy is going to be awesome. We also have people with a lot of different and interesting perspectives talking about that. And really cool, I think, body of literature that we're going to be talking about, a lot of different examples from the history of fantasy and all of that. And then, hey, at the end of February, we're talking about the history of fantasy and the evolution of fantasy as a genre.
So until next time, see you guys.
The Book Table is a podcast from Backroom Whispering Productions. Our theme music is by Mark Wayne. If you like this podcast, rate us on iTunes. Or get in touch with us on Twitter at Backroom Whisper, on Facebook at facebook.com/backroomwhispering, or by email backroomwhispering@gmail.com. See you next time!
you.